All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into, another part of Fanny's travel log. We've got a really compelling excerpt here for Fanny, and it picks up after that truck incident that we talked about, in France, and traces her journey as she continues to Lisbon, and then, sort of a new chapter starts when her friend Laura joins her, and I think our mission today is to kind of really peel back the layers of this personal account and, look for the key moments and what they tell us about long distance travel and personal growth.
I think this part of her adventure is particularly fascinating because it's after this moment of vulnerability, right? She has this really unsettling encounter, and then we really get to see how she picks herself back up and decides to keep going. And it gives us a lot of insight into the mentality of a long distance traveler.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. So the excerpt picks up with Fanny seeking refuge in Madrid. After that truck encounter, she spends a night at a friend's place. And one of the things that jumps out at me immediately is just that stark contrast, from that really vulnerable situation on the road to the simple but profound comforts of a shower and a bed and feeling safe again. I think it really highlights the reality of this kind of travel.
Yeah, I mean, that moment in Madrid, I think, is more than just about physical comfort. It's like a psychological reset,
Yeah.
after a potentially, traumatic experience. I think having that return to normalcy allows her to process what happened and, make a conscious decision about whether to continue. And it really just speaks to, I think, the mental toughness that long-term travel requires.
Yeah, and from that point of safety, Fanny starts to reflect on risk and reward. And, she talks about how even before leaving Budapest, she was just bombarded with all these warnings about the dangers of hitchhiking. And, within those first 72 hours of her trip, some of those, potential negative scenarios, they did play out, to a degree. And yet she was so determined to not let fear kind of, dictate her experience.
What's interesting is she almost directly refutes, this narrative that's based on fear. And she makes this point that bad things can happen anywhere. It's not limited to the road. And she gives some examples like, sexual assault being followed, robbery. And those are all things that can happen just as easily in your own neighborhood. And it kind of makes you wonder, is this fear that we have about traveling, is it out of proportion to the risks we face every day?
Yeah, and I think she's suggesting that, this fear of the unknown can really distort our perception of how dangerous something is compared to, the dangers that might be closer to home. And she makes this great point about not taking risks just to avoid the "I told you so" moments. And that really resonated with me. It speaks to this idea that this fear of judgment, it can really prevent us from learning and growing.
And she talks about leaving your comfort zone, and she frames it in a completely different way. It's not about being reckless. She says it's about self-discovery. It's about the thrill of learning, and that word thrill, I think, suggests that, it's an active choice to engage with the unfamiliar. It's about seeking out challenges that can, kind of accelerate your growth as a person.
And that leads into her whole concept of the university of life, and she admits that at first there might have been this part of her that wanted to prove everyone wrong, all the people who doubted her. But that view really evolves. She comes to see that the road itself is this incredible learning environment. That constant immersion in new situations, it really sped up her evolution.
I think if you think about how people learn, firsthand experience is always so much more powerful than theoretical knowledge, and Fanny's University of Life is exactly that. It's like this immersive course where she's constantly being confronted with new things, and she has to adapt and learn and grow in a way that probably wouldn't have happened, if she had stayed at home.
And, those new things, those new situations, they often came in the form of, incredibly diverse encounters. Every ride she got brought a new person, a different background, a fresh perspective. She was exposed to this whole spectrum of views and cultures and reactions and beliefs. And I think this leads to a pretty profound realization for her.
Yeah, I think it's this realization that there isn't just one truth, that there's actually, millions of valid perspectives, and her own truth is just one of billions. This acceptance of these different viewpoints, it seems incredibly liberating for her. It kind of frees her from this need to judge or to hold on to prejudices or to try and convert other people, to her way of thinking.
Yeah, it's like a form of intellectual and emotional liberation. She doesn't have to waste energy on, conflict or trying to enforce a single worldview. This openness becomes something that she actively seeks out as a way to continue to grow, and she specifically links this to a feeling of freedom.
And I think, this feeling of freedom combined with this new outlook, it propels her forward. And so after that night in Madrid, she's back on the road, with this fresh perspective. And she covers a lot of ground. She reaches Lisbon, which is her initial destination, in just 4 days. So we're talking about, somewhere between 3,300 and 2,500 kilometers.
Mm.
And that's an incredible pace.
Yeah, that's huge. And, Portugal has a special significance for her. She calls it the birthplace of her travel spirit. What does she mean by that? Was it like a sudden spark of adventure? Was it shedding these inhibitions, or was it more of a gradual awakening?
It seems like Lisbon was the place where her more conventional ideas about staying within her comfort zone, where those ideas started to dissolve, and it was where this seed of this desire for long-term travel and a different way of seeing the world, it was planted there. So going back, I think it must have felt like returning to this very foundational point in her journey.
Yeah, like coming full circle. And, before she meets up with Lara, she takes some time to reconnect with Lisbon on her own.
I think that's important, that solo exploration. It allows her to kind of revisit the city through the lens of everything she's experienced and how her perspective has changed.
She even goes back to this favorite student restaurant that she hadn't been to in 7 years, which is amazing, and she remembers the specific escalator and the corner that really stood out to me, the sense of familiarity. It must have been like this anchor, this feeling of security after spending so much time in unfamiliar places and in unpredictable situations.
Yeah, I mean, that memory of the escalator and the corner, I think it speaks to how deeply connected she is to Lisbon and how much, those early experiences shaped her. And it's a good reminder that, certain places can kind of become these touchstones in our lives. They offer us this sense of continuity, even as everything else is changing.
And then there's the practical side of things. Finding a place to stay. She uses this online platform, and she ends up staying with a host who has 44 positive reviews. That kind of trust, in these types of exchanges, it really speaks volumes.
I thought it was interesting, the reason that the host gave for opening up his home. He said he wanted to experience the world, because his work kept him from traveling. And it's just this wonderful example of reciprocal exchange, and Fanny, having been a host herself, she really understands and appreciates, that dynamic.
Yeah, it really shows how interconnected travel can be, and how these platforms, they can benefit both the traveler who needs a place to stay and the host who's looking for connection. And then comes this anticipation of meeting Lara, and she describes it as this unusual feeling, not romantic, but carrying a similar weight of excitement, for a potentially significant connection.
I think the excerpt captures that anticipation really well. It's this sense that, this meeting could lead to something really meaningful. And I think it speaks to this very human desire for companionship and that feeling that, sometimes you just know that a new relationship could be important.
And it seems like her intuition was right on the money, because the moment they met at the metro station, there's this instant connection. Like, French Boy's prediction that Lara would be this perfect travel companion for her. It was spot on.
Yeah, I mean, that immediate rapport just shows, sometimes there's just this chemistry between people that you can't explain. And it sets the stage for, what becomes a pretty pivotal part of her journey.
Yeah.
They spend the next 5 days exploring with Laura's other friend, and their bond grows so strong so quickly that they decide to hitchhike back to Budapest together, which is another, 3,500 kilometers or something like that?
Yeah, and another huge undertaking, and after such a short time together. And what's interesting is that hitchhiking as a pair, which, you might think would be harder, it actually turns out to be easier and more enjoyable, and a lot of it has to do with Laura's energy.
I think that shows you the impact that shared experiences can have and, the different energy that people bring to a situation. Laura's enthusiasm, it seems like it was contagious. It made hitchhiking, which can be pretty unpredictable. It made it feel less daunting and more like an adventure, that they were sharing together.
And Lara herself sounds like just a remarkable person. Fanny doesn't go into too much detail about her personal history, but she emphasizes that despite, some hardships that Lara has faced, she has this incredible joy for life, and she becomes this real inspiration for Fanny and like a teacher in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah.
And how people who have, overcome challenges, they sometimes have this unique appreciation for life and this ability to inspire others. And Lara's outlook, it clearly had a profound effect on Fanny.
And Fanny also touches on the contrast between her own beliefs and, some of Lara's more unconventional habits. Lara's very spiritually open-minded. She expresses gratitude a lot. She connects with nature, by touching plants, walking barefoot. She's a vegetarian, and they have these really interesting conversations. And, this is all very new territory for Fanny. Her own beliefs are quite different.
That's a really interesting part of the story. Instead of reacting with judgment or dismissing Lara, Fanny approaches her differences with curiosity. She observes her. It's almost like a scientist studying a new phenomenon. And I think this non-judgmental stance is a really good example of the open-mindedness that she had been developing, throughout her trip.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, deliberate observation rather than judgment, and this period of shared experiences and observation, it leads them to the next phase of their journey, which is hitchhiking from Lisbon back toward Budapest.
Wow.
They have a really smooth first day. They get a ride to Madrid pretty easily, and then they continue on toward Marseille in France, which is where Lara had initially planned to move to.
What's interesting is that when they arrive in Marseille, Lara has this immediate intuitive reaction. She just says she didn't feel the vibes. And Fanny talks about how Lara makes a lot of her decisions based on feeling rather than, strict logic. And it seems like that intuition really plays a big role in shaping their plans.
Yeah, and even though they had these arrangements for 2 nights with Moroccan hosts, and they gave the city a chance, Lara's initial feeling didn't change, and what's striking is how easily she just decides to change her plans. Fanny really connects with this flexibility, this willingness to just, adjust course based on intuition and what feels right in the moment.
I think that's a real hallmark of experienced travelers, that willingness to, deviate from a set plan and embrace unexpected opportunities.
Yeah.
I think that's often where you find, the most memorable and the most enriching experiences.
And this change of heart about Marseille, it opens up new possibilities. Fanny suggests that Lara come spend time with her in Budapest, and Lara is immediately on board. And then on their way to Hungary, they take this detour to Nice to visit French boy, Alex, who's someone that Fanny hadn't seen since they were in China together. And you can really feel her excitement about this reunion.
Yeah, and this unplanned reunion, it kind of highlights the interconnectedness of all of Fanny's travels and, the fact that she's formed these relationships that have lasted. And I think that time that they spend together camping in the mountains and having these, meaningful conversations, it probably gave them a much needed break and a chance to, deepen that existing connection.
And then after that, they hit the road again. And Fanny says that, the next few days of hitchhiking went pretty smoothly. They even got this really memorable ride in a Rolls Royce, which, talk about diverse encounters.
Those moments of serendipity that are part of the magic of this kind of travel. You just never know who you're going to meet or what you're going to experience. And that's what makes it so unique.
But probably the funniest ride that they get is in this truck that's transporting chicken shit. Lara asks this innocent question about what he's carrying, and the driver gives this really blunt and honest response, and they just end up cracking up, these 2 exhausted travelers. It's just this perfectly absurd travel moment. It's so relatable.
Yeah, that story really captures the humor, of hitchhiking. And it's a good reminder that even when things are, kind of mundane or a little bit unpleasant, there are these moments of levity and human connection that can pop up anywhere.
They do eventually hit a snag, though. They end up waiting for 4 hours for a ride just outside of Zagreb near the toll booths. And because of where they were, Fanny couldn't use her usual proactive approach of, going up to people and asking for rides, so they were forced to just rely on, sticking their thumbs out. And she mentions that this was a really clear sign to her of how much more effective her usual method was.
Yeah, and that's a really good practical insight into the nuances of hitchhiking. It shows the value of, being proactive and engaging with people, rather than just passively, giving a signal.
And by this point, the exhaustion from the journey, it's really starting to catch up with them, Lara even falls asleep at a gas station at 5 a.m, and Fanny has what she calls her human check engine light moment, where she realizes they need to acknowledge their limits and stop pushing themselves so hard.
That moment of, recognizing their fatigue, both physical and mental, it's really important. It shows that they're self-aware and that they're willing to prioritize their well-being over sticking to, the original plan, no matter what.
And then they make the very sensible decision to end the hitchhiking portion of their trip and take a train from Zagreb to Budapest. It's a wise choice given how exhausted they were.
Yeah, and it brings their hitchhiking adventure to a close.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take away from all the amazing experiences that they shared. And it's a good reminder that even the most adventurous journeys require you to be flexible and to know when to, change course.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Fanny's travels, I think there are a few key takeaways. We see this transformative power of stepping outside your comfort zone. The impact of human connection, especially her bonds with Lara, and this vital importance of staying open to new experiences and new perspectives, even the ones that challenge our beliefs. And then Lara's influence, it really highlights the value of intuition and, being adaptable and finding joy in the present moment.
And I think, Fanny's initial thoughts about the dangers versus the reality of what she actually experienced, that offers a really great framework for thinking about our own fears and, the potential for growth that we might be missing out on, by staying within our comfort zones.
And that leads us to our final thought for you today. As you reflect on Fanny's journey, think about what comfort zones in your own life might be limiting your understanding of the world and maybe more importantly, your understanding of yourself. It's something worth exploring, don't you think? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Absolutely.
Until next time. See you then.